So far in the course, we've been pretty abstract. We've been looking at machine learning models of probability networks. So we've looked at Bayesian networks, we've looked at hidden market models, and last week we just started talking about real neurons, but still in quite an abstract way. We looked at how this machine learning algorithm, the hidden market model, could get implemented by a bunch of neurons. The last two lectures are going to be a little bit different. We're going to look more at biology and how these algorithms can be mapped onto particular neural systems. This week I'm going to give you, I've called this lecture two stories about Hippocampus. I'm going to give you two conflicting machine learning explanations of what the Hippocampus could be doing. We really don't know which, if either of them is right, and indeed a really good exam question would be to compare these two stories. Next week we're going to look at two stories about what the cortex could be doing from a machine learning perspective. The Hippocampus, there's a structure here in the human brain. It has this incredibly weird shape that you can really only comprehend if you get a 3D model of it and actually poke around in it with your hands. Supposedly it's called the Hippocampus because it is in the shape of a seahorse. And if we take a cross section, we can see this structure down here, according to some people, looks a bit like a seahorse. And if we zoom in on it, we get this circuit down here. So the names of these structures, there's the entorhinal cortex, which is the major input structure to the hippocampus. Then there's a pathway leading through this structure, the dentate gyrus, through to CA3. Then the signal comes back down through a region called CA1 and back to entorhinal cortex. There's another area called subiculum that I'd like to mention at the end. The classical view of the structure is there's a loop. Information comes into entorhinal cortex and it goes around this loop and then it comes back to the deeper layers of entorhinal cortex. It's generally modeled by structures something like this. There's variations on it in different models. The idea is you have this superficial layers of entorhinal cortex receiving sensory input from a whole bunch of sensory systems. So this includes things like very high level vision, very high level touch, very high level sound, and also your sense of odometry. That's your sense of self-motion. If you're a robot, odometry means how many times your wheels are turned round as you've been moving. That estimates the distance. So the RAS equivalent is how many steps have I taken, roughly. These things are all coming in from the highest areas of the sensory mode. So we're dealing with very high level percepts. Things like perceiving the Sydney Opera House in a visual image, or perceiving a famous actor or actress. So you might have heard of Haley Berry neuron. This was a genuine grandmother cell discovery a couple of years back where they found particular cells in hippocampus responding to specific people and specific objects. So it's that kind of thing, very high level conceptual information. And you can kind of think of the hippocampus as sitting right at the top of the perceptual hierarchy. We're going to look at cortical models next week, but you've all seen this idea of recognizing objects by recognizing lines and then corners and then groups of edges and corners and shapes and faces. So you kind of build up this hierarchy and then sitting right at the top of the hierarchy is the hippocampus, dealing with these high-level objects. We can think of entorhinal cortex superficial layers basically as an input vector. It's our current highest level percept as well. This all projects down into dentate gyrus, and the dentate is generally modeled as doing some kind of sparsification. Your coding scheme up here might still have redundancy in it. For example, when you see a particular person, you might always hear them saying the same thing, so there's redundancy in that input coding. So you might want to do something like principal component analysis, or some way of reducing the coding scheme to something simpler in the dentate. After this pre-processing step, there is the CA3, and this is the area, when people talk about hippocampal modeling, they generally mean they're modeling CA3. This is the part that has strong recurrent connections, and so you can get all excited about what these recurrent connections might do. In theoretical computer science, there's a big distinction between structures that have loops in them and structures that don't. So you've already seen in the Perl message passing, actually, all of that algorithm only works for networks with no loops. And you can do this nice feed-forward inference process on it. As soon as you put a loop into anything in computer science, it suddenly gets interesting. Mathematically, you can build things that are Turing complete, which means they're able to compute any given algorithm if they had enough memory once the loop is there, and they become much more difficult to analyze than things that are feed-forward. So after this recurrency, there's the area CA1, which is possibly doing a kind of decoding step. You can think of moving from a basis in entorhinal cortex, a decoding scheme for information. We've moved into this sparse code, which is maybe still preserved down here, but then you want to get back to the coding scheme that was used in the input. And CA1 is sometimes, but not always, implicated in doing that kind of decoding. There are other people who've implicated it in things like goal seeking and action selection, but we're not going to talk about that in either of these Hippocampus stories. And then the output from this, it goes back to the other layers of entorhinal cortex that's stored in the deep layers of EC. So you might think of this whole system as doing some kind of denoising. You might think of the input as being a noisy representation of what's in the world, and you're somehow processing it at a very high level and mingling it all together between different modalities, and you're getting out a similar representation to what went in, but everything is now affecting everything else. So perhaps if some of this information was missing, you might be able to fill it in by using information around it. Still going to talk about the biology for a bit, then we'll look at these two stories. Let's just go through the areas in a little bit more detail then. This is the entorhinal cortex. So as we've said, it receives this highly multimodal input from various very high-level cortical areas, including these regions, postsubiculum and presubiculum, which are giving you this odometry information. So they find things like head direction cells, which fire when you're pointing in a certain compass direction, or when you think you're pointing in a certain compass direction. And these odometry cells that fire when you're moving, either moving forwards or in a direction. It's also getting input from prefrontal cortex, which we really have no idea what that does. I haven't seen any models of this, but some kind of executive functioning that might be implicated in this sort of memory process. The entorhinal cortex it's part of cortex, so you guys have seen the 6-layer structure of cortex. Entorhinal cortex only has 4 layers, kind of a mutated version, perhaps, with the rest of the cortex. And it's usually split into 2 regions, the superficial layers, which are the inputs, and the deep layers, which are the outputs. There is some interaction between them. Why does it only have 4 layers? Maybe it has something to do with the fact that it's sitting at the top of this cortical hierarchy. If you think the cortical hierarchy is doing something like the Perl messages that we saw, the Perl messages have these different steps where you're computing information to send up the net, information to send down, and combining it together. But if you're at the top of the whole hierarchy, then maybe you don't need to do part of those steps. There's nothing to send information up to. So it kind of makes sense that you're missing a couple of layers when you get right up to the top. A particular set of inputs in entorhinal cortex are these grid cells. These have attracted a lot of attention in recent years. They're cells that have receptor field figures like this. These two figures are maps of an arena. There's a rat running around in the arena. The track here shows where it's run, and the dots show where one particular cell always fires. And you can see they make this hexagonal pattern. And if you plot it out properly, you get a pattern like this. So this is a kind of a spatial coding scheme. There's a whole bunch of grid cells with slightly different frequencies, slightly different sizes, and you can represent a point in space by the activation of a whole set of these grid cells. This is telling you something about the type of coding for space. So they're found in the medial part of entorhinal cortex, and there's an increase in size as you move from dorsolateral to ventromedial. So grid cells, there's also head direction cells, which similarly are firing for, in this case, coding for direction. They're often modelled as these continuous attractors. This is still in the entorhinal cortex. This is still just the input to the real hippocampus. So you get models that look like this. In this case, it's head cells. We've got a circle of head direction cells around the edge, which fire if you're facing in a certain direction. There's 2 more populations that fire if you're facing a certain direction and moving, either moving left or moving right. And you can figure out ways of setting the weights so that this acts as a memory. It will store the latest place you were at, and then if you move, it will move the activation around. So it's done by positive weights between directions that are close to each other and negative weights that are further away. And you'll get a bump of activation here, which will gradually move around as you feed it with odometry information. So this is for head direction cells, but you'll see similar models for grid cells as well, like this Probabilistic picture. Let's go through the hippocampal structures then. After entorhinal cortex, we hit the dental gyrus. So as I mentioned, this is often modelled as doing something like principal component analysis. Again, there's different flavours of this. You might have heard of independent component analysis. More recently, we've had probabilistic principal component analysis and so on. But your vanilla PCA is this idea. Here's a data space. Here's 2 types of input, X and Y, and a whole bunch of data there. And you can see there's a pattern in the data. It really has this inherent dimensionality of lying along a line like this. So that line is called the first principal component. And there's a line orthogonal to it, which is the second principal component. If you do this in really high dimensional space, you can have hundreds of dimensions, and you find in many data sets the data lies on some kind of plane or a lower dimensional hyperplane than the original data. So these principal components can be written in terms of the original vectors. They're weighted combinations. This vector is it's kind of a lot of horizontal and a bit of vertical motion and vice versa. That one. It's really easy to implement this neurally. If you assume your data has been demeaned, so we have vectors u of t with a mean of 0, and you can just assume a linear activation neuron. Each neuron here has got some weights coming in from the input vectors. So each input is a vector at a point in time. You can then choose when the neuron fires. So this is like membrane potential. Again, it's a mathematical abstraction, it's an activation. Think of it as membrane potential. And we can set up winner-take-all dynamics. So in this case, you fire. You either fire or you don't. That's a Boolean SI. And you fire depending on whether your activation is greater than all the activations of the other cells in your population. Okay, so this is a competitive network. Exactly one cell fires each time. And then you can throw in some pretty standard looking Hebbian learning where you say, did I fire? If I fired, make my weights more like the input that caused me to fire. So this is just a fancy way of specifying whether we're going to be positive or negative learning. It's just saying if I did fire, then this thing is positive, and so I become more like the input I just saw. If I didn't fire, this thing is negative, and I make myself less like the input. So here I've got some LTP and some LTD. I'm weakening the weights if I was less like that. If you put all these dynamics together, you will get principal components analysis out of it. You'll get a neuron that wins most of the time, which is detecting activation on the first principal component. If it doesn't win, then the next principal component neuron will claim these activations that are pointing that way, and it will learn to become more like that, and the lesser neurons will pick up on weaker principal components. So this is discussed in Diane and Advert, and it's really easy. You can build this in MATLAB. It's just 5 lines of code to build neural PCA. Entorhinal cortex then was giving us a big vector of sensory inputs, and we've seen dentate iris can do some kind of sparsification of those inputs to give us a nice reduced coding. What do we actually want to do with all this information? The CA3 then is the real heart of the hippocampus. This is what people generally mean when they say they're modelling hippocampus. CA3. If we look in the rat, we find these place cells. Place cell is it's similar to the grid cells we saw, but it's a cell that fires in just one place in an arena. So whenever the rat is here, this cell will fire, and if it's here, that cell will fire. Whereas in the grid cell, the cell fires in a regular pattern of places in the arena. So the history of these goes right back to O'Keefe and Dostoevsky, 1971, and this was very exciting work because it suggested that there could be a map of space contained in this particular neural structure. So the idea is each neuron in CA3 could be representing one place, and as you navigate around in space, your CA3 map of the world is updating to say where you are. It got even more exciting a few years ago when people started to find replays and pre-plays. In the original place cells, you could track the rat's movement around an arena by watching which neurons were firing, and you could use those firings to recover a path like this around space. So they then started finding these patterns when the rat wasn't moving. So for example, after he's run around the arena like this, he'll then sit here for a minute, and the same neural activations will replay. It's like he's remembering what he just did. He's replaying the experience of running around the maze, maybe at 5 to 10 times the speed that the firing originally happened at. They've also found these replays during sleep. So again, if you want to speculate, you can say the rat is dreaming about following this path and remembering what it was like. And they've also found pre-plays, so just before the rat sets off to run around the maze, he plans out what he's going to do. He's kind of imagining all the experiences he's going to have as he runs around the maze. Again, there's a danger of getting too speculative here, but this is a top-down modelling course, so I think we're allowed to speculate because we want to build models of these kinds of processes. So this was my story. This is all based on findings in the rat, and the rat hippocampal story then is that CA3 consists of cells representing places, and it is inferring which place am I at each point in time, and maybe simulating places I've been at and places that I will be at. This was a nice story. It's very nice to model, but it goes a bit wrong when you start looking at other animals like primates. You suddenly find cells responding to all sorts of things that aren't like this. So you get cells in monkey responding to objects in the world, to the task you're currently doing. Things like how am I moving, what speed and direction am I moving in, what's the texture of the surface I'm on, all these other facts about the world. possibly including things like these Haley-Berry neurons responding to very particular events. It's not clear to me exactly where the Haley-Berry neuron is. We went through the paper, and because it's done on humans, you can't exactly do histology on human volunteers. So they tell you what they did to get the recordings, but it's not completely obvious which part of the hippocampus they were in. But it would be nice if they happened to match up with CA3, because it would fit with this primate monkey story. There's also, if you go for the patient HM, right, he was the famous hippocampal amnesiac, so he lost part of this structure and wasn't able to recall episodic memories. In fact, did you see them slicing his brain up about 2 weeks ago? It's streamed live over the internet on the webcam. So another process happening in CA3 is that choline modulation. These recurrent connections can apparently be disabled when a certain choline comes in, and it seems to occur in beta waves at 10 Hz oscillations. So it looks as if we're periodically enabling the recurrent connections and then disabling them again. Part of the computation is done using recurrency, and then there's a step that isn't, and an alternating between them. This is the receptive field of a single place cell. It was taken as an average over all this data, and you can see it's approximately Gaussian. Okay, those are the main structures. If we assume that CA1 is basically just decoding whatever happens in CA3, then those are the most important parts we need to look at. This is a model from Arleo and Gerstner from Biological Cybernetics. It doesn't deal with the recurrent connections, but it's a pretty detailed model of what happens before that. Arleo and Gerstner have the visual information input coming into a population of cells which they do heavy learning on the visual input, and they're forming representations of the structures in the visual input. Similarly, they've got cells responding to place. When they made this model, the grid cells weren't invented, but if they built this now, they'd put grid cells in there. And they do some more heavy learning down here, and they show that heavy learning can induce a set of place cells here. So you find cells up in this part of the network with receptive fields like this. So you can see they're kind of correlated with place, but they're really picking up on something else. They're picking up on a property of the visual input that is common to all those different places. Whereas the proper place cells have fields like this. This is more like the Gaussian one recorded on the previous slide. So this is fusing the odometry information in with the visual information. And they go on to use it to do action selection and navigate around an arena. All of this is just done with ordinary Hebbian learning. So it's neat. You can create these place cells just with Hebbian learning. What does this have to do with us? What does it have to do with Bayes? My interpretation of this, when I see some input and I see a hidden variable like space, is to think hidden Markov model. This is the hidden state of the world, place, and we're saying what's the probability of being out of place given all these observations. In this case, we've got odometry observations and we've got vision observations, two sources of evidence coming in. So it's interesting that they didn't bother putting in the recurrent connections in this model. If you really wanted to make a hidden Markov model, you'd then go and extend this. You'd say, I want to condition my place now on the previous place, as well as conditioning on the data, and you'd probably get much better navigation results if you did that. That would be an interesting one to try. So if you make this interpretation, if you think of the whole population of CA3 as representing all these different places, then the activation of one of those cells, like in the RAO mapping, the activation of each cell is going to give you something like a probability of being at a place. And so importantly, this kind of model can represent a probability distribution over a place. You can have all the different places laid out and a probability function over them. So not only are you saying where's the most likely place I'm at, but you're saying what's the spread of my belief, how uncertain am I? So for example, if all your inference had gone wrong and you were lost, you'd see a fairly flat distribution of activity over place cells, and that's something you could recognize and hopefully do something about, like taking an action to go to a familiar place. But you need the probability distribution to make inferences like that. There's a few people who have put in the recurrent connections in this spatial framework, in this rat-driven theory of being through place cells. Actually, not so many models. It was quite hard work digging out things to refer to in this part of the story. If we go back to 1996, the model by Muller, again, modeled each CA3 cell as being one place, and then they set the weight to tell you the distance between places. So in this case, the place cells are really a map of space. The connection strength telling you how easy it is to get between them. I should mention that place cells aren't topographically organized. There isn't a 2D chunk of place cells that looks like a little map. They're just scattered all over the place. So the structure is all in weights between them, but it isn't a physical organization. So they set up this model of weights connecting places together, and then they kind of gave in and they used the computer science algorithm called dynamic programming to find paths between different places. There was never a neural explanation of what this could be doing. But in more recent years, we've seen this upgraded to a whole class of continuous attractor models. The latest one I know is with Kali and Diane. So this is kind of building on those ideas from the head direction cells and grid cells, where we set up a continuous attractor like this. Here's a bunch of sensory inputs, here's the places, and again, the weights between the places are coding the distance, just like in the Muller model. Except now we're dealing with a bump of activation, and as you put in different sensory inputs, that will move the bump of activity around. So you can't quite interpret this as a set of probabilities, or at least I don't know how to. If I knew how, I'd write a paper about it. But you can roughly think of it as being a spread of belief. You'll see this bump over different places, and the part where the bump is peaking is the most likely place you're at, and the size of the bump could tell you something about how uncertain you are of being at that place. Yeah, it would be very neat to explain this probabilistically in the future. This is two different aspects of the spatial model. So the earlier model is giving you a kind of likelihood function. It's doing dentate gyrus computation, taking principal components with the sensory input and giving you a probability of receiving that input given that you're at place. Then we've got these recurrent models which are modeling the weights between place cells as distance and telling you which places you can move between easily. So if you put those together, you get something that looks a lot like our friend the hidden market model, right? You've got a hidden state which is the place you're at each point in time. You've got weights connecting hidden states over time together, which are going to be these strengths about distance, telling you how easy it is to get from there to there. And then you've got the likelihood observation, telling you how likely is the entorhinal cortex input vector. This is one of the models that we built here as part of the biotech project. We did exactly that mapping. The DA3 population is mapped onto the hidden Markov model, hidden state beta, and the meaning of that is it's with all the different places you can be at. I've grouped together the entorhinal cortex and the pre-processed version all as a big input vector. I just take it as a numerical vector and use that as the input. Then we've mapped the recurrent CA3 cells to the transition probabilities, and then we've mapped the weights from the input structures again for CA3. Those are these likelihood observations. So then you can construct a hidden Markov model that looks like this. So your hidden state is now a whole set of place cells. The colours show the activations of the place cells, and over time we keep putting in these sensory inputs. So in our case, they're things like simple visual features and robot whisker touch features. They all feed in to do this inference and update the population of place cells, so you have a nice hidden Markov model. If you were to extend this, and again, if anyone's still looking for an MSc project, we'd very much like to extend this to EM learning. So we talked about this idea of alternating between doing inference steps and doing weight updating steps last time. So you make an inference about where you are, and having done that, you change the weights to make your probabilistic model of the world better. And we mentioned last week, the extended EM algorithm has to be done offline. There's some new ideas about trying to do it online. It becomes fused with a problem in robotics called SLAM, which is the same task but from a purely robotics view rather than a hippocampal view. How do you build a map of the world and find out where you are at the same time? This all seems to smell a lot of Hebbian learning. Again, these feature oscillations I mentioned before, where you're alternating between using the recurrent connections and do inference, and then maybe turning them off while you do some learning, is looking very hidden Markov model-like. So that's the place cell story. According to the rat data, CA3 is this population of place cells. You could interpret it as being a probability distribution in firing rates, giving you a belief about where you are, and you're updating it according to sensory inputs, and you can denoise the inputs to give a better version of them. It's a neat story, but it misses all this stuff from humans and from primates about there being a whole bunch of cells representing objects in the world, and Haley-Berry neurons and Sydney opera houses in the whole thing.
What I don't understand is you say that the Hippocampus is representing place cells. The main argument is making that it represents some kind of body. So I don't understand how that is not, what you're saying, it misses out the fact that we skeleton system in primate. It seems to me that it's pretty much saying the same thing, but in primate it was probably not making place cells. Different kind of
So I think in the rodent story, if you're dealing with a population of place cells, for this probability distribution to have any meaning, the cells have to be mutually incompatible with each other. So if you're at this place, you're not also at that place. The distribution of firing rates is giving you a belief distribution over all the possibilities. With object cells, you could be perceiving two objects at once. There could be Haley-Berry and the Sydney Opera House, and they're not rivals anymore. So you can't make this probabilistic interpretation. You can't say the probability of Haley-Berry is 75% and the probability of the Sydney Opera House is 25%, because you could be seeing both. But in the place cell, you're dealing with a real distribution. Here's all the alternative states of the world lined up in a vector, and you've got a distribution of it. I'm going to talk a little bit at the end about attempts to put these two views of the world together, so people are thinking about it. I'm going to go back to some machine learning theory for a while then. This is what you guys were reading last week about bolts and machines and popular networks. So we're going to go back to the abstract for a little while and then talk about bringing it down to Hippocampus. So your reading is about a new class of probability models which are undirected. So this is not a Bayesian network. A Bayesian network is connected by directed arrows with those little probability tables saying what's the probability of a child given its parents. This is a different kind of network called the Markov random field. Here the links are undirected. And the links, they still contain weights, but now they're symmetric weights. And the weights are saying how compatible are the two things at the end of the node. For example, you might have memories of encountering different sets of people in seminars and meetings. So here's a collection of people you might encounter in our building. And it may be the case that some of these people are very often encountered together. So if you have a supervisor and a student, you'll often find them together, or two students of a similar age, or two paper co-authors. And there could be pairs of people who don't like each other, who have negative weights between them because they're actively avoiding each other, and you never encounter them together. It's a metaphor for objects in general, right? You often encounter certain pairs or groups of objects together in the world. And this isn't causal, there's no arrow. You might argue that there really is a hidden cause between these things. There might be two people who like each other and there's a hidden cause that they're both working on a project together. But this type of model doesn't take that into account. You're saying, again, think of the cortical hierarchy. You've done all these steps of hierarchical inference and you've run out of inference. You're at the top of your network and you just have to say things correlated. You give up trying to find a causal explanation for anything. There's slightly different ways of setting this up. Different books will present it differently. I'm going to use the way of Boolean nodes. So each node is either a 0 or a 1, depending on whether the object is 0 or not. In some books you'll see -1 and 1, which gives a slightly different formulation for mathematics. Using the Boolean setup, then, we can write the probability. This is the joint probability of the whole network. So X is the collection of nodes, Xi is an individual node. And we can write it in this way. We've got each node has a bias term associated just with the node, and each pair of nodes has a weight between them. If we expand this out, so the X of the sum becomes a product of factors. They're called bias terms. These end up down here, and these look a lot like priors on the individual nodes. And these terms are, we just call them pairwise factors, or pairwise potentials between the nodes. We're saying the probability of the whole network is given by a product of these pairwise interactions and priors or biases on the individual nodes.
What do you do to the weight to get to your pairwise interaction?
So I've just defined this. I'm defining phi as being x to the xwx.
Right.
Yeah, that's a straight definition. These networks are good for doing associative memory models, right? If you're told that Tony and Kevin and Jim are in the room, who else do you expect to find what's the probability distribution of the other people? Which is the kind of thing you might want to do in a large-scale memory. You've remembered a little bit of it and you want to fill in all the missing parts. There's different ways you can do inference on these networks. I'm mostly going to talk about models that use an inference tool called Gibbs sampling, but I just wanted to demonstrate that there are other algorithms too. So this is how you do the Perl algorithm on a Markov random field rather than on a Bayes net. So the Perl algorithm was pretty complicated in the directional networks, right? We had lots of sides deriving the individual messages. It's much simpler on an undirected network because you don't have this difference between parents and children. So in particular, do you remember the Markov blanket? Markov blanket is all the nodes that affect the given node. In the case of the directed networks, the Markov blanket was quite complicated and it included co-parents. So it includes parents of your children. In the undirected case, it turns out that the market blanket is only my neighbours, and there's no difference between parents and children anymore. There's just a set of neighbours, so everything gets simplified a lot. So as in the original field equations, we're trying to compute the probability of X given all the evidence we've observed. So E could be evidence scattered all over the network. And because of this market blanket property, we can write it as there's prior on X, and then for each of my neighbours already has a probability of being on conditioned on the evidence related to it. So you remember this notation? If you took this node Y1, then this would refer to all the evidence going to X via Y1. So it would be any observed nodes up here. Assume each of those nodes has already computed its belief, which is that term. Then you use this pairwise factor connecting it with X, multiply it in, and you can compute the belief in X. And this can propagate all around the network. So effectively, these terms are the messages that you're sending. And it turns out then to send the message, all you do is you take your spirit belief and you divide out the pairwise potential that came in through that neighbour. So you can kind of see this is a reduced version of the big Pearl equation.
How do you define what order it goes?
You can do it in any order you like. All of this stuff only works for tree-structured graphs, as I should have mentioned, like in the Pearl equation. You can prove that it always converges to the right answer if you have trees. If there's any loops, then your stuff.
And no matter which thing updates which thing, it will always turn out.
Yeah, because there is a right answer. There's a right answer what the probabilities are, and it will always run back. When you have loops, it gets crazy, and you can have all sorts of weird computer errors if you get your order really short. That's just to show that there's nothing special about a Markov random field for how you do inference. You could just run Perl inference on it. But the cases when we use Markov random fields, for some reason they always seem to be quite loopy graphs. So my explanation for this would be, there's this story that normally you want to do causal modeling. You can have this hierarchy of cortical areas where everything's causing the thing below it. But eventually you run out of causality. You get to the top of your network and you have to make some sort of decision, and so you give up the causal story and you just say, let's assume everything can be correlated with everything else. But kind of because you're in a situation where you've given up on causality, it means you don't know very much about the structure of the problem anymore. You're just saying there's a whole load of entities and some could be correlated with others, but we don't really know in advance who could be correlated with who. Typically then, we might have 10 people in the example and we just start by assuming that everyone could be correlated with everyone else, because we don't know any better. And because of that, you've got a highly loopy graph. Every node is connected to every other node, and so your Perl algorithms don't work in a situation like that. There's lots of other cases when Markov random fields come up, and they all seem to be quite complex problems compared to problems where you could use a causal net. So this loopy structure seems to go alongside there. I'm going to introduce you to a different way of doing inference in these networks. And again, this is an inference algorithm rather than a network, so you could run this algorithm on a directed network. When you do inference, you always take your favorite kind of network and your favorite algorithm and you put them together in combinations. So this is Gibbs sampling algorithm. And it's especially useful in very loopy networks when the Perl algorithm is just fallen over and died. Gibbs sampling works in a stateful way. You run through the algorithm in a loop, and at every point in the loop, each node is either on or off, so it has a particular state. So remember, eventually we want to know stuff about probabilities of nodes, but during this algorithm, each node is getting turned on and off as we go around the network. And Gibbs algorithm goes like this. You pick a node out at random, so again, the ordering doesn't matter. You compute what's the probability of me given the state of all my neighbours, yi, this set of all my neighbours. And remember, in this algorithm, the neighbours each have a state. Each neighbour is either definitely on or definitely off. And so I can compute a distribution over whether I should be on or off by taking my prior and the product of all the messages from the neighbours. But then, unlike the Perl algorithm, I draw a sample from there. So this is a stochastic algorithm. I take that probability distribution and I flip a weighted coin according to that distribution. So if there's a 1/3 probability of me being on, then I actually make myself on, given a 1/3 chance. So I actually toss a coin here to decide whether I'm going to turn X on or not. And then I repeat. That's the whole Gibbs sampling algorithm. So you have your whole net is laid out and you go around, you pick nodes out, and you say, am I going to turn you on or am I going to turn you off, depending on the nodes around you, and you do this thousands of times. And it turns out, I'm not going to do the proof because it's hard, it turns out that this will produce perfect samples from the joint distribution. So if you take all the states that the network was in at the time, they are equivalent to states that have been drawn from the true joint And if you're interested in the distribution of one particular node, then the distribution of samples of that node will be correct. If you run it for a very heavily quoted long time, and exactly what this means is highly debatable. The proof requires you to run it for an infinite length of time, which is not very useful if you're about to get eaten by someone. So it's kind of debatable whether the proof is really applicable to the real world. So GIF sampling, then, you might have heard this expression, MCMC, multi-code sampling. So MCMC is a more general way of doing inference by sampling. So for example, you might not want to sample one node at a time, you might sample a whole bunch of nodes at a time, and you can come up with all kinds of clever strategies for sampling different things. You'll often see this used in biological data analysis. Now it's becoming a popular way of doing the stats at the end of the paper. So nothing to do with neural computation, it's just a way of doing probability theory. But this particular form of GIB sampling looks much more neural because you're dealing with individual units one at a time. And you can kind of think of it as a spiking neural model at discrete times. At each time step, the network is in a state, and each neuron is either firing or it isn't. And at the next step, you go around all the neurons and say, am I going to fire now or not? And the collective distribution of them is giving you the probabilities that you're interested in.
Do you sample a whole, like a subset of them all at each time step, or do you sample one at each?
In the pure Gibbs algorithm, it would be written like this: take one node at a time and update it. But you could, I think, equivalently, you could update the whole network one step at a time. They're not quite equivalent algorithms, are they? Because you're updating yourself, given that your neighbor has already updated. So it's a different set of numbers, but I think they turn out to be equivalent. Again, in practice, if you're not running for a long time, you can run into problems and try hacking your code with these slightly different kinds of updates. You remember then, back in the Bayes net lecture, we talked about what are the different questions you might ask of a Bayes net. With Perl equations, you only get to ask one question. You say, what is the probability distribution over this node? What's the probability distribution that the alarm is going off? But we talked about other kinds of questions you could ask, like what is the most probable state of the whole world together, which is not necessarily the same thing as the most probable states of all the different components in the world. With the GIF sampling algorithm, then you've got this distribution of states of the world represented by all your samples, but you can also do the thing called annealed GIF sampling, which can help you with the question, what's the most likely state of the whole world? And if you're interested in perception, this seems much more like what we would want the perceptual brain to be doing. The perceptual brain doesn't present us with a fuzzy distribution of possible worlds. It presents us with a single coherent view of what we're looking at. When you see a Necker cube, you don't see an inward Necker cube and an outward Necker cube. You see one cube at a time, no matter how hard you try. So the annealed version, this is based on statistical physics. The idea is, so this is the same algorithm as before, right? I just copied the slide. But all I've done is I put in this little term here, and this term's called temperature. We reduce the temperature at each step. So it's the same algorithm as before, but we've got a number t which starts at 1, and every time we go around, we reduce it a little bit. So alpha is 0.99 in this case. We just say make t go down exponentially. So what is this doing then? The samples, initially then t is 1, so it's the same algorithm as before. We're drawing samples with their real probabilities. But as the network becomes cold, to use the physics analogy, you become more conservative about the probabilities you take. So if you have something that has a 3/4 probability of being true, at temperature 1 you would set it to true with a probability of 3/4. But as the temperature becomes very cold, you say 3/4 it's much more true than it is false, so we'll almost certainly make it true. We're kind of amplifying the probabilities. You make a 60% probability look more like a 90% probability, and you make a 30% probability look more like a 10% probability. And again, there's a convergence proof, which I'm not going to go into, that says if you do this slowly, if you were to reduce your temperature at an infinitely gradual rate and get eaten by the cat in the meantime, then formally this will always converge to the global optimum. That will give you the most probable state of the whole world. In practice, you can't run it infinitely slowly, so you often land in a local optimum, which is usually good enough for what it is you want to do. We can take the limiting case of this process then. What if you just set the temperature to 0 right at the beginning? And so now, every time you take a node out at random, same equations before, these are messages, there's prior, distribution, and we're going to draw a sample from it. But now we're going to be completely deterministic. If you're at 0 temperature, then you always set the node to the most probable state. So even if there's a 51% chance of it being on and a 49% chance of it being off, we're always going to set it to 1. This is the deterministic version of that equation. We're saying set x to the value that maximizes the probability. In the physical analogy, it's a freezing cold network. There's no energy being put into the system to let it do unusual things. It's always relaxing to do the most probable thing. This network, historically it was developed before the probabilistic version by Hopfield, and it's called Hopfield network. But I think nowadays it's fair to say we can look at it as the 0 temperature limit in case it gives sampling. So you'll see the word the Boltzmann machine then just means Markov random field. That means the undirected network plus Gibbs sampler algorithm. These are completely separate things. We say a type of network and a type of inference algorithm. You can create other kinds of machine by having a directed network with Gibbs, or you can have a Markov random field with a different inference algorithm. But the Boltzmann machine is just a label for this combination. We're going to think of the Hopfield network as the limiting case of a Boltzmann machine. This is an example of a Hopfield network running, and we're going to build this in the second half of the lecture. We're going to write this from scratch in MATLAB again. These are visual characters, they're letters, DJ, CN. Each pixel in the letter is a node in the network. So we've got, 25 nodes, and they're connected together by weights. And this huge matrix gives you all the weights in this network. Yeah? So it's each node being connected to each other node. And you can see the weights are just 2 and -2 and 4 and -4 in this case. This isn't necessarily going to be an image, right? You could think of the 25 pixels as representing 25 people who you encounter in the psychology department, and these weights are the links between them. You're given some noisy version of the input. So let's take one where it's worked. You see here, this is letter D, but it's been corrupted. You've observed that node wrong. And so when you run the network, when you do that annealed Boltzmann machine process, the network will pull itself into a global minimum or global maximum of the probability, which has gone back to one of the memories that you stored. So this set of weights is acting as a memory. It's remembered there are these 4 patterns that occur. And so if you present something that looks a bit like one of the memories, then the network will run and it restores it to the rest of the memory. Here's noisy versions of M getting restored to the M. They don't always work. Sometimes you'll get spurious things happening, like this hasn't quite got recalled properly. We don't have an example here. Sometimes they'll accidentally store different patterns that weren't part of the training set. It's not a perfect form of memory. But it's giving you this idea of what an associative memory could do. It's a recurrent network like we see in CA3. Every node is connected to every other node with symmetric weights is different from the Markov version. That endows it with this ability to recall memories based on partial or noisy versions of the input. Very briefly in passing, I'm just going to mention the existence of mean field inference. This is yet another type of inference you can do on the network. I did a lot of this in my thesis. So Gibbs sampling is one alternative you could reach for if you have a looping network. The mean field version is a different approximation you can make. And what you do in this case is you say there's a true joint distribution probability of x over all the nodes. You say it's too hard computing P of x, but what we'll do is assume there's a different distribution Q of x, which has this very particular form. This is the distribution of the joint is the product of the individual nodes. So each node has its own little distribution. You're assuming that they're independent of each other. So in the real P they're not. Nodes can be really strongly correlated. But you pretend for inference that they're uncorrelated, and it becomes much easier to find a solution if you make that assumption. So it turns out, and again, we don't care about where this comes from. I'm just showing you that here's another inference algorithm which gives rise to a message. So just like in the Perl algorithm, we're saying each node is going to update itself according to some equation which is a function of the nodes around it. So this is the probability of x given the Markov blanket of x. And I'm going to update myself according to some function of these messages received from the nodes around me. And again, you can think of the Gibbs sampler as a kind of message passing algorithm. Each node is receiving information from its neighbors about whether they're on or off, and it's updating itself accordingly. So all these different algorithms, they do look quite neural. They're all doing these local computations, sending messages between neighboring nodes, and then the nodes are, in the case of Gibbs, they're either firing or not firing. In the case of mean field inference or in Perl, you think of it as a firing rate, giving you a numerical probability. You can implement this with things that look a bit like leaky integration in neurons, like weight-coded models, which is done in Diane and Abbott. So think of the Gibbs sampler as being a bit like spiking neurons. Think of mean field, also known as variational inference. Think of this as being a bit like a weight-coded model. Importantly, a weight-coded model can't represent correlations between nodes because you've made this mean field assumption. So if you're deciding whether to use a spiking model or a rate model, then maybe it's important to think about, do I want to represent correlations? Let's go back to Hippocampus then. Within this associative memory framework, you can divide models into two rough categories. These are the Hopfield-like models. This is another project that was partly done in Sheffield called IKEA. It was done by our colleagues in Budapest. So they literally modeled the CA3 as a Hopfield network. They have the training phase and the recall phase. And during the recall phase, remember the feature oscillation? The acetylcholine tells you when to turn off all the recurrent connections. So you have a burst of acetylcholine, which turns off all the recurrent connections, and that allows you to put an input pattern onto the network. And whatever you're currently perceiving in your entorhinal cortex gets mapped onto the CA3 cells and forces their activation. And then in the next phase, you put the recurrent connections back on, and you turn off the input part, and you let the network converge just exactly as a Hopfield net. It converges into one of those associative memories. So it's just like recalling the character patterns in the McClay example. So this is really dependent on this idea of an input phase and a recall phase. You're setting the input on the net and then letting it do its recall and then reading the output. The other way you can set these kinds of network up is what is called an external field likelihood model. In these cases, the input is constantly applied. So this is modeled from Rolls, slightly different notation, but you can see there are recurrent connections and there's an input link. So the point here is that the inputs have always been applied, almost like a magnetic field influencing what happens in the recurrency. And so rather than getting a set of discrete patterns being remembered, you get more of a continuum. You get a continuous attractor model here. But conceptually, they're doing quite similar things. They're both saying that nodes in CA3 each represent the presence of a thing, a fact about the world, and they're finding these correlations between the facts, and given an input, they give you a modified version of that input where you've used all this prior knowledge you've learned about correlations to give you a better interpretation of what's currently happening. This model is done by Ed Rolls, he's also an experimentalist. He's one of the big people who found these results about CA3 neurons responding to objects in monkeys in the first place. That was two different stories about Hippocampus. The hidden Markov model story came from the rodent literature, and it assumes CA3 is a big collection of mutually rival place cells. You're either at one place or you're at another place. Weights in CA3 are assumed to be asymmetric, and they give you the probability of being at a place conditioned where you were before. You could make them symmetric if they were just distances, but you might have a case where the animal always runs in the same direction along a track, and so there's a much bigger probability of going from here to here than going vice versa. It's not what the animals used to do. Because we only have a population of place cells, we can interpret the whole distribution of activation in CA3 as a probability distribution over the place. What we have here then is that the state of the world is very simple. The state of the world only has one variable, which is what is my location. And because the state of the world is simple, it means our belief can be quite complex. We can have this distribution over those states. The second story I've given you is this Markov random field story. This comes from the primate literature, saying there's all these cells in CA3 responding to particular objects, particular facts about the world. Importantly, these nets all seem the weights are symmetric. As far as I know, there is no biological evidence at all for CA3 weights being symmetric. It's just an assumption of the model. And in these cases, you can have place cells, but the place is just one component of your whole subset. The subset contains all these other objects as well. You might have a cell responding to being in this lecture theatre and another cell responding to a gym. And so the idea is we find, this is my own phrase from a paper I'm writing at the moment called unitary coherent set states. Unitary means there's just one interpretation of the world. You don't have this distribution of belief. You just say this is the one best explanation where the Hopfield network has converged on. This is the single best state of the world that we're going to see. And it's coherent because it's a complex world. It isn't just a place, it's a whole collection of facts about people and objects and location. You've traded off this ability to have a distribution of belief. You've traded it off for the ability to have a complex coherent state of the world. But your coherent state of the world is unitary coherent. You've only got one. You've lost all the Bayesian uncertainty about it. Just to finish off then, it's always a bit of a caricature. There's these two opposing views fighting it out. Right? In reality, no one is championing either of those views. Everyone is discussing how can we combine them together. And you'll find two models done by the same person. One is a spatial model and one is an associative model. The active research area now is all about how can we combine the spatial aspect and the auto-associative aspect. So this is something I've been working with very recently. This is something called a temporal restricted Boltzmann machine. And the idea is you have lots of little Boltzmann machines, associative memories chained together over time in the shape of a hidden Markov model. Yeah, so you have this hidden Markov model structure, but then within the structure you have these little Boltzmann machines. And the equation for it, without getting into too much detail, it sort of looks as you'd expect. This is a hidden Markov model term. This is the probability of something at time t given the state of it at time t minus 1. That's a hidden Markov model term. This is a Boltzmann machine term. This is the probability of some observations and the hidden state happening together. And again, you can write it out in exponential form and see all the rates dropping out here. So this was suggested just a couple of years ago, and only in a conference abstract. This isn't even published yet. This was suggested by Becker and Hinton as being a Hippocampus model, where again you have the dentate gyrus and the entorhinal cortex coming in and recurrent CO3 connection. And as part of the biotech project here, I'm trying to build on this and extend it. So this is a little insight. This is something we just sent off. But again, we have the standard architectural model of an entorhinal cortex and dentate gyrus and C3 and some decoding. In the Hinton model I showed you, he was using the rate coding. It's like the mean field assumption. I've changed this to run more like a Hopfield network, where it's finding this unitary coherent state of the world, just giving me the most likely view of the world. And we run into a problem that sometimes you get it wrong, and because you've thrown away all your uncertainty, you're not able to detect whether it's wrong, because you're just saying the world is like this. So we found it useful to extend the model with another circuit here, which acts as a lostness detector. It says, assuming I was right, what would the world look like? What would my sensors be? And how do they compare with the sensors we've actually got? This is going to be a role for the speculum. That's the other bit of Hippocampus I mentioned at the beginning, which I've painstakingly ignored since then. So speculum is able to compare how well we're doing, what we think the world should look like with what it actually looks like. It can tell when it's gone wrong, and if we've gone wrong, then it can fire the acetylcholine down. And so we've got a new interpretation of what the acetylcholine signal is doing. We think it's acting as a lostness detector, and so you're turning off your priors. If you realise you're lost, then your previous location no longer carries information about where you are, so you should disable your transition priors. So this is ongoing research in building this stuff. I hope you enjoyed 2 stories about Hippocampus. For next week, we're going to again do 2 rival stories, but about cortex